get everyone from the waiting room. And good afternoon and welcome to World Oregon's webinar today, May 12th, on the security threat that binds us, challenges to ecological and national security. We have a great set of partners and a special guest here today. We're thrilled to have you join us. We'll be diving into the substance very shortly. First, just a reminder that today is a World Oregon webinar through Zoom in which only the panelists will have their video and their audio on. Everyone in the audience, you can post questions in the Q&A function of Zoom, and we encourage you to do so for the speakers. And we will post things in the chat as things go along with links to reports or other items. I would note this is a busy next week or two with some great webinars. Hope you join us not only today, but tomorrow in a program we're doing with the World Food Program called Wheat Fields to the World, Oregon Hunger and Humanitarian Aid, looking at how agricultural products from Oregon make it their way around the world through the World Food Program. This weekend, our young professionals have their Long Reads Club. And in late May and early June, we have a program on rethinking American grand strategy and challenging China. Some great programs, all free webinars. Encourage you to sign up on our website. As a reminder, as with most World Oregon webinars, we're recording this for later posting to YouTube. And again, we appreciate your support as a member or a supporter. And in fact, it's a good transition to, I'm going to now introduce the moderator of today's program, the secretary of our board of trustees, Nav Dayanan, who was the host of our recent very successful fundraiser World Quest, April 29th, which many of you in the audience I know supported. He is an amazing person, not only in his day job at the Nature Conservancy, but also as serving as trustee for World Oregon, and we're thrilled to have him moderate today's discussion. Without further ado, Nav.
Thank you, Derek. It is indeed a pleasure to serve on the board of trustees for World Oregon. As you mentioned, in my day job, I serve the mission of the Nature Conservancy as a senior policy advisor. And it is a pleasure to be able to bridge these two worlds through this program today. We at the Nature Conservancy are delighted to be partnering with World Oregon and the Council on Strategic Risks. Welcome all to today's program on natural security. We have three distinguished speakers this afternoon who will cover the following themes in their remarks. The natural resources are the foundations of economies worldwide. If we believe that nature sustains us, we will need to make some significant investments. Most conflicts around the world emerge from disputes relating to natural resources, and that we're facing a dual crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change. You will also hear about how we can manifest US leadership and commitment in this context. To participate in the discussion today, please use the Q&A feature to pose your questions. We will do our best to accommodate them after our speaker presentations. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. First, we will hear from United States Senator Jeff Merkley, who's a champion for conservation and climate change, both here in Oregon and around the world. Among many of Senator's contributions to public service, he is instrumental in advancing our foreign policy and foreign aid decisions as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee that funds foreign aid and oversees US interests globally. Next, we will hear from Christine Cavallo, who is a fellow with the Council on Strategic Risks, and she is also the co-author of a new report on ecological security, which she will elaborate on shortly. And finally, I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, Tom Course, who leads the Nature Conservancy's land policy work within our North America Policy and Government Relations team. Thank you to all of our speakers, and welcome to Senator Merkley now.
I think you all can hear me, but I'm having trouble getting the video turned on, so hold on just a second.
That's great, Senator. We can see you well.
Okay, there we go, finally. All right, that's great. Well, thank you all for the introduction. And there seems to be a time delay on the computer. There we go. Yeah. It just took 10 seconds to process that command. It's a pleasure to join all of you, and thank you to the Council on Strategic Risk, World Oregon, Nature Conservancy for hosting this conversation. These issues are so important. Many years ago, I was a presidential fellow at the Pentagon working on the threat posed by nuclear weapons. And I took that position after having been focused on economic issues in the poorest countries of the world. I switched 180 degrees to nuclear weapons because the opportunity was presented to me and because I thought that is the biggest threat to the planet. And so there's a moral obligation to work on it. And after leaving the Secretary of Defense's office, I spent the 1980s working with the Congressional Budget Office for Congress on those same nuclear risk issues. Well, at that time, I didn't know a thing about climate change. Scientists were starting to observe that it existed, but it wasn't common in the discussion. And yet here we are, not so many decades later, and the greatest threat to America's national security, our biggest threat ever posed to human civilization, is without question, as I like to call it, climate chaos, and the human-led activities that create it, the human-led activities that are devastating our planet. These atrocities include the burning of fossil fuels, which pumps enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, the devastation of our rainforests, which serve as natural resources that pull carbon out of the air if they're left undisturbed, and yet we see them being very much disturbed by human activity. Earlier this year, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, announced that the Pentagon would, and I quote, immediately take appropriate policy actions to prioritize climate change considerations in our activities and risk assessments to mitigate this driver of insecurity. And he pointed out, and I continue his quote, there is little about what the Defense Department does to defend the American people that is not affected by climate change. It is a national security issue, and we must treat it as such. We think about these issues that are driven by climate change: food insecurity, migration, loss of habitats and livable land. All of these magnify conflicts and create security risks to the United States of America, and certainly humanitarian challenges throughout the world. Entire communities and cultures live near the coast, rely on seafood for some part of their diets, and they're having to contend with hotter, more acidic oceans, impacting the sea life. In fact, in the state of Oregon, we see that with a much more acidic ocean, so much so that we have to artificially buffer the water for our oyster seed, the baby oysters, or they now die. Farmers and ranchers the world over are facing hotter, drier weather year after year, ever worsening droughts, more devastating wildfires. Again, Oregon can bear testimony to that. 3 years ago, I took a trip to Africa to visit the nations that were involved in what was being referred to as the 4 famines. I wasn't able to visit all 4 of them. Northern Nigeria wasn't able to go to, and Yemen I wasn't able to go to. I did go to Somalia. And as I was speaking to the president of Somalia, who is a former American citizen, he was a dual citizen, and he noted that there had been a massive destruction of the forest from deforestation, and such that they had lost 80% of their forest over the span of 30 years. And that was because the forests were being cut down to create charcoal for people to basically sustain cooking fires, and in some cases sustain heating. He also noted that the loss of that forest had changed the conditions on the coast. So you had a microclimate that was impacted, that was increasing drought and creating, therefore, more food shortages. Across Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, more than 650,000 children under age 5 face severe malnutrition because of climate change. That leads to instability, it leads to migration, it leads to conflict. And it's not, of course, just happening in Africa, and these issues span the globe. I did want to mention the destruction of rainforests in Malaysia and Indonesia. And we are tied into that. There was a law that was changed in Congress when they were trying to do something productive on biofuels to address climate, and it created a demand for palm oil. And palm oil is incredibly versatile. It's used in just about everything: soap, bread, candy, ice cream. And once this law was changed, demand for it went off the charts. And when demand went off the charts, massive devastation of rainforests in Malaysia and Indonesia. The orangutan, by the way, is a victim of that. And unless we get world cooperation quickly, we may well see the extinction of the wild orangutan population. And all sorts of corruption is connected to this, as well, by the way, in which false land deeds are created, all sorts of strategies to essentially take tribal land and convert it into for-profit, privately owned land to produce palm oil. So I've been trying to find a path for us to change the demand for palm oil, or for nations to work together to change the structure to support Indonesia and Malaysia in stronger protective laws. Those local forces, those economic drivers are very, very hard to stop. So we have that challenge. And when you destroy the rainforest, you destroy oxygen producing, carbon sequestering locations. The challenge is such that NASA, which is now doing more and more space-based observation, noted that the destruction of Indonesia's rainforests has contributed to the largest single-year global increase in carbon emissions in the last 2,000 years, transforming that country into the fourth largest source of carbon emissions, something that I think in a trivia contest few of us would get right. I don't know if that was one of the World Quest questions or not, but maybe for World Quest next year when the World Affairs Council hosts that. These actions create so many emerging challenges for the world community to work on, the humanitarian, but also the national security side. Like Secretary Austin said, we need to treat climate chaos as a national security threat that it is, and respond accordingly. As a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as a champion on taking on climate chaos, these are issues I feel pretty passionately about and try to press on every frontier for our nation to address them. I'm really pleased that we've rejoined as a nation the Paris Climate Accords. And we need to do everything we can in partnership to take on issues like the deforestation, not just in Indonesia and Malaysia, but the Amazon, which accounts for a quarter of the carbon absorbed each year by global forests. And we have a big challenge right now with President Bolsonaro, Brazil's president, who has really facilitated the destruction of the Amazon rather than championing the protection of the Amazon. Last year, deforestation hit a 12-year record high. You have huge amounts of territory being burned or cut down every single year. In fact, so much change has occurred that a recent study said the Amazon has turned from a greenhouse bank, if you will, that sequesters carbon into a net greenhouse gas emitter. That is a massive, massive change. We have to figure out how to work with the government of Brazil for this to be take a very, very different course. A group of us, myself and several colleagues, we sent a letter to John Kerry, as Biden's special climate envoy, to really express concern about this, the accelerating destruction, a threat to climate chaos, and to support his efforts to engage the Brazilian government. So far, I can't say that we're having great success in that area. And there's been almost a situation in which Bolsonaro has suggested kind of the sense of a world ransom, saying, well, maybe we'll stop depending on how much compensation we get. there are situations in the world where employing local people to become protectors of natural resources, we've seen this in a number of places in Africa, has been an effective strategy where the economy has changed to one of tourism and people have a stake in protecting rather than in destroying a natural resource. We have to figure out if there's a path to do something the same in the Amazon. I worked to get USAID funding dedicated to combat deforestation. We won that. I also tried to get us to condition funding of Brazilian military programs on a change in the government's attitude, their policies there. I did not succeed in that. Another piece I wanted to mention was just that as we're thinking about our ecosystems, and it was mentioned in the introduction, that we're seeing a loss of biodiversity. One factor driving that is our own failure to have strong policies regarding the smuggling of animals and animals' parts, and which is why I wrote a bill called Rescuing Animals with Rewards Act, which had been proposed by advocates and was signed into law last year. It really rewards whistleblowers who know the inside of the illegal trade for coming forward and helping to stop it on everything from rhinos, elephants, all kinds of illegal wildlife. I'm going to stop because there's so much to consider, but we didn't always think of security and environmentalism as parallel issues, but now we recognize that they are, and we have an administration that highlights that at every opportunity. And so now I thank the sponsors of this program once again for using this occasion to highlight that connection. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We really appreciate your thoughtful comments and particularly your leadership to address the biodiversity loss that we're facing in tropical countries. So thank you for calling special attention to that issue. We're very grateful to you and thanks for being here. Now I would like to welcome Christine Cavallo of the Council on Strategic Risks. Thank you, Christine.
Hi, thank you, Nab. I have a few slides, if we could get those up. Thank you. So first of all, I want to say that I'm so happy to be a part of this event and continuing the great momentum of natural security that we have going right now. Thank you so much also to Senator Merkley for your time and for all that you already do with World Oregon, as well as the national and international stages to champion these issues. My goal in speaking today is to highlight the field of ecological security as well as its critical implications on sustainability, stability, conflict, and human rights issues. The next slide. I'll start with a quick look at our organization, the Council on Strategic Risks, which is a nonpartisan institute that explores major systemic risks in the 21st century. The Council on Strategic Risks was created in 2017 to house what already existed, the Center on Climate and Security, as well as the new Jan E. Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons. The Center for Climate and Security was first founded in 2010 to pursue a vision of a more climate resilient world. It recognized already significant, unprecedented, and potentially existential climate change threats. And then the Nolan Center explores how we might pursue threat reduction related to the future of nuclear warfare and arms control, as well as bioweapons. So the third program, the Converging Risk Lab, emerged at the intersection of these two programs to explore what might happen when climate change and nuclear concerns intersect. That lab brings together experts across our wide scope of research and studies the converging cross-sectoral risks that are present in our very rapidly changing world right now. Our most recent work looks at the edge of natural security to what we see as a deeply unrecognized threat, which is called ecological security. Next slide, please. So ecological security describes elements of human, national, and global security that arise from ecological destruction and disruption and the collapse of ecosystems. This includes a lot of topics that fall under the more traditional climate-based umbrella of natural security: storm surges, wildfires, hurricanes, and rising temperatures. but it also researches the network of ecosystems and life on Earth, extinctions, disease spread, biodiversity loss, ecosystem services, and ecological processes. The loss and degradation of these services actually tend to run parallel to climate-related issues, such as warming or natural disaster events, and are often also caused or exacerbated by them. But there's a second driver, which is the human activities, such as poor land use practices or unsustainable resource consumption. Ecological degradation directly impacts human life, and human life in turn impacts ecological systems. And how we think about and engage with these elements matter a lot. Ecological risks have been vastly underestimated, even as our understanding of more traditional forms of natural security have advanced in the 21st century. These ecological networks are fraying or even unraveling in some cases. I'll now go into some of the forms that impact that degradation, which is often pretty devastating and irreversible. The report we produce is rather exhaustive and covers a wide-ranging topic, so I'm really excited, and I'll do my best to get this all across to you, but please feel free to ask any follow-up questions. So we're looking here at ecosystem services, which are a major under-recognized part of ecological security. There are three broader categories that ecosystem services fall into: regulating, such as water purification and soil health; material, such as food, medicine, and energy resources; and non-material, such as tourism or even psychological and spiritual benefits. Our interactions with nature and natural spaces involve a lot of different systems, including food production, fisheries, forest integrity and wildlife biodiversity, or water quality and availability. But the issues that may arise in these areas are never as simple as just the raw number of fish caught or the trees cut down. There are innumerable other factors that are tied to the density of forests, the area of contiguous uninterrupted habitats, or the quality and capacity of soil and vegetation when faced with extreme weather events. The total severity of risk posed by the loss of these services is huge, potentially equal to the existing scope of climate change and natural security, despite not even being considered within that right now. It's a distinct and separate threat with under-recognized value and impact. And as human populations and resources demands continue to expand, we are pushing these systems to a breaking point. Next slide, please. So when we strain ecosystems, we challenge their ability to function as designed. When that change grows too significant, ecosystems may reach a tipping point at which they sort of irreversibly unravel. This is what's known as a regime shift. These occur in aquatic, terrestrial, or transitional biomes, as well as in climate systems. An example in the terrestrial space would be a forest ecosystem that goes through a savannization process. Next slide, please. This is the transition from a forest to a desert. The human-driven components that may push an ecosystem towards this threshold include deforestation and land conversion. From 1980 to 2000, over 55% of the more than 100 million hectares converted in the tropics came from intact forests. In Latin America, cattle pastures were the largest driver of this conversion, which causes forest thinning, habitat fragmentation, and strains ecosystems' ability to function over time. The human-driven wear and tear then intersects with climate change-related stressors, like floods and drought cycles or naturally occurring fires. As these natural events grow more frequent or extreme, or as ecosystems weaken in their resilience, the impact that each event has is potentially far greater. The ecological degradation that then results from this include plummeting biodiversity, while ecosystem services are destroyed. As Senator Merkley mentioned when discussing palm oil plantations and the Amazon, this altered land is often no longer able to function as an active carbon sink, and therefore also loses its ability to regulate storm surges and a lot of other regulating properties. While this is studied a lot academically and pretty often, these ecological losses are virtually absent from security and policy discussions. The Amazon specifically has undergone extensive ecological change. Scientific models suggest two possible points of no return. The first is a warming of 4 degrees Celsius, which you may have heard is a key benchmark in a lot of environmental policy spaces. But the second is deforestation that exceeds roughly 40%. Brazil alone hosts 30% of all forested spaces, between 15 and 20% of all biodiversity on the planet. It's estimated that 17% of the Amazon has already been lost in the past half century alone. And if another 20 to 25% is lost, the global biodiversity hotspot could reach one of these critical tipping points into a positive feedback loop of drought, fire, and canopy loss that just further exacerbates the problem. The impact of this biodiversity loss are potentially devastating, but our current understanding of these systems is too low to even calculate it fully to appreciate it. Next slide, please. There's also major overlap between natural resources and conflict. Illegal logging undermines legitimate forest activities, robs governments of revenue, and poses threats to sustainability by crippling the resource wealth of a state. Illegal logging, mineral extraction, and wildlife smuggling are profitable and relatively low-risk endeavors. A 2018 report identified environmental crime as the largest source of income for non-state armed groups and terrorist organizations. Revenue from the illegal timber trade finances violent conflicts in many countries and creates haven for illicit drug activities that can proliferate in forested regions without oversight. Moving to the oceans, states must expand their fishing fleet range to collect adequate food supplies for their populations. This enables illegal, unsustainable, and unregulated fishing markets to operate under the increasing murkiness of overlap with foreign vessels in international waters. Between 1950 and 2000, over 80% of armed conflicts occurred in forested regions and other biodiversity hotspots. In addition to the ecological damage created by those immediate conflict zones, the state resources are then funneled away from conservation and other initiatives to support military efforts instead, which then creates further space for these illicit activities to occur. The revenue stream provided by these activities are not novel, but as ecological stress grows, the value of controlling resources will change and escalate. Coupled with biodiversity loss at high levels, a major crisis is looming right at this intersection. Go next slide. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. I know I am, but got a lot to do. So one key element that I do want to highlight is just how serious the loss of biodiversity is. In January 2020, the World Economic Forum report on global risk perceptions identified for the first time that biodiversity loss is one of its top 5 global risks, both in terms of the likelihood it will happen and the impact that it will have in the next 10 years. Analysis suggests that the current rate of species extinction is as much as 1,000 times that of the background or natural extinction rate, and it's accelerating. Put another way, the time that it would take for species to naturally go extinct over 10,000 years, we have compressed that to about 100 years just through human activity and influence. At the same time that population diversity is going down, invasive species are exploding to a problem on every continent. Connected trade networks, human mobility, and globalization have actually pushed much of these recorded invasions into high-income countries, occurring at a rate of 30 times higher than low-income countries. As a result, some key US allies, such as Australia and New Zealand, view combating and preventing invasive species as priorities important to their respective national security doctrines. According to the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, nearly 1/5 of the Earth's surface is at risk of these plant and animal invasions. Next slide, please. So, the last year has woken us up to a lot of blind spots. A glaring example is the growing nexus of humans and wildlife, which increases the frequency of chances for animal-borne diseases, essentially spilling over into humans. We need to change how we view and tackle these issues in our security landscapes moving forward. So this slide and the next slide offer first 3 fundamental precepts that can create the necessary structure for thinking about and addressing these blind spots. And then the next slide will be 3 key recommendations for policy and action. So these precepts, first being only centrally appropriated and coordinated funding, programs and structures through the US Congress, then combined with effective interagency coordination in the executive branch, can directly and effectively address ecological disruption at the scale necessary. This can be done by elevating ecological security in US national security policymaking, promoting international conservation, combating environmental crime, enhancing water and food security, as well as strengthening pandemic preparation and building local capacity. Secondly, the infusion of science and science expertise into the defense, diplomatic, and intelligence communities will be critical for comprehending and responding to the problem. This requires leaning heavily on science and engineering fields atypically engaged in national security, such as conservation biology, disease ecology, forest service, soil science, and more. The US government, thirdly, must reboot its overall national security doctrine and architecture to tackle the modern threats that are presented by this changing planet and the degradation of its embedded socio-ecological systems. Next slide. This is our final slide, final recommendations. The first being to support international efforts to reverse and reduce the drivers of ecological disruption, including strong international alliances and targeting transnational environmental crime, which includes ratifying international conventions and integrating more sustainable practices into our global systems. Secondly, we must protect and expand critical systems and services, including efforts to better manage protected areas and monitoring to reduce pandemic risk at point of origin, such as within the wildlife trade. Thirdly, we must amplify ecological and natural security issues domestically, create a research agenda around those issues, and engage the public, which means increasing our understanding of these threats, developing early warning indicators, and building advocacy. Communities around the world are being forced into decisions that work against ecological security and are crippling their long-term stability. Any economic, social, or policy approach that disregards that ecological footprint is going to be ultimately long-term flawed thinking, and it will damage these livelihoods at a systemic level. So with that, thank you for all of your time. Please do send questions my way or explore the full report, which is linked in the comments.
Thank you, Christine. That was really very helpful, and it sets us up well for our next presentation by my colleague, Tom Kors of the Nature Conservancy. Welcome, Tom.
Great, thanks, Nav, and thank you, Christine, World Oregon, and Senator Merkley. It's really great to be with you all here today, and thanks to everyone in the audience for tuning in. Most importantly, thank you, Senator Merkley, for all the leadership you've provided on conservation and international issues. We really, really sincerely appreciate your service. I got to conservation from an international development and intelligence background. I was an agroforester in Senegal with a Peace Corps. I worked at the UN Secretary to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and I also worked on environmental issues for the Central Intelligence Agency. And I can tell you, knowing from my experience, that nature can be a source of many conflicts, but also nature can sustain peace like no other. And so I want to continue some of the themes that you've already heard about today, about the scale of the problem our planet faces and where the Nature Conservancy and other partners are putting our time, money, and effort to address these dual crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. And my takeaway for you is that the United States and our allies can step up on commitments for nature and people to thrive, both domestically and internationally. As Christine pointed out, next slide, we've been so impacted by this pandemic, and conservationists and epidemiologists have been trying to sound this alarm for quite some time about this broken relationship and that it has real consequences. And we know from this large report from IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biological and Ecological Services, that we are losing biodiversity very rapidly, and that deforestation and degradation of wildlife habitats is a significant driver of zoonotic diseases. So this report, as Christine pointed out, found that nature is declining at the fastest rate in human history. A couple of factoids that really stick out with me is that we've lost 70% of our species since the 1970s. And the other thing that is really quite interesting is that all animals on the earth, 96% are humans and are domesticated livestock. Only about 4% are wild. Next slide. So, for example, the illegal trade in species and animals and plants is big business, which undermines biodiversity. But as you've heard, it also fuels networks of bad actors. And we've seen in areas, as Senator Merkley pointed out, with large tropical forests, such as the Amazon or Central Africa, Southeast Asia, that illegal logging is estimated to account for about 50 to 90% of all forestry activities, according to Interpol, the Intergovernmental Criminal Police Organization. Also, Interpol reports that trade in illegally harvested timber is worth about 51 to 152 billion annually. And also, illegal trade in natural resource commodities like timber, but also seafood, really undermines global markets. It depresses prices, and it makes it hard for law-abiding US companies to compete. And so when we work to stop illegal trade, and when we help countries manage their natural resources legally and sustainably, new markets for US products open up, and US jobs and US companies' supply chains are protected. Next slide. Report by the Center for Advanced Defense Studies analyzed also similarly transnational security issues, and there's some interesting data and detail to show just the nature of trade in African pangolins, and how that trade goes to Asia, and how it unfortunately is growing. Last year, there were more pangolin scales seized globally than any other year for which data is available. And I've got some statistics that'll give you an idea of that. But we also saw the biggest individual seizure of pangolin scales on record. So we're actually starting to track this a little bit better, which is great. For example, 1 week in Singapore, a 14.2 ton shipment was intercepted, and it was estimated to be from more than 70,000 pangolins. So according to the World Economic Forum, with a value of about 7 billion to 23 billion each year, illegal wildlife trafficking is the fourth most lucrative global crime after drugs, human trafficking, and arms. Think about that, and think about who is actually doing that. So next slide. This brings me back to the issue that we're talking about of how humans interact with nature and how it impacts public health and safety. And we know this every day, as even more and more as we're now beginning to understand the links between the destruction of nature and the spread of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. So spillover of zoonotic diseases, COVID-19, SARS, Ebola, bird flu, Zika, and others are exacerbated by a number of factors that the trade, trafficking, and human consumption of wildlife known to transmit these diseases. It's exacerbated by the lack of available better protein sources for communities that depend on nature for their sustenance. It is exacerbated by deforestation and habitat degradation. And finally, it's exacerbated by humans encroaching into wilderness areas where they are spillover hotspots, which also includes livestock. So reversing this trend really is about so much more than just conserving nature. It's about improving health. It's about improving and boosting economies, and it's about reducing the impact of natural disasters. And as Christine pointed out, the World Health Organization even stated that protecting and preserving nature is the single most important thing we can do to ensure a green and just recovery from the COVID crisis. So next slide. So what can we do? We can boost regional stability through community-based conservation, and there are models where communities are directly involved in decision-making and projects, and the most important thing is that it's working. For example, this picture is from northern Kenya. The Nature Conservancy has been working closely with a group called the Northern Rangelands Trust, which receives support from the US government. NRT, as it's known, has brought together 39 local community conservancies to help them manage their lands, but also to create economies that grow out of conservation, and also drive down poaching, which has helped with peace efforts up in the north of Kenya, and has also helped end years of conflict there. The approach there with NRT has resulted in about a 96% drop in the number of elephants killed for ivory. It's also helped local food security, helped protect water supplies, and also kind of kept out extremist groups that were previously there. But with the global pandemic, models that work like this are being put at risk. The model with NRT is heavily dependent on tourism revenue. And we know that tourism is going to bounce back, but we also know that in a lot of these local economies, we've got to diversify income sources to help steward natural resources over the long term. And so what is it going to take? It's going to take a concerted effort here in the United States, both here and abroad, to support these conservation programs. Next slide. So we know that government policy and investments are important to reverse the current trend. And another takeaway for you is that we need to increase what we've already been doing. And this really gets down to money. And that means private money, it means state money, it means federal money, it means international conservation accounts. And on this slide, we put out a report in the UN General Assembly in September of last year. It's called Financing Nature. We did it with the Paulson Institute and also Cornell University. And it talks about biodiversity funding globally. And the big number that we need for biodiversity globally is estimated to be about 700 billion a year, but we're only spending about 145 billion a year. So somehow we need to walk some of those big numbers down into accounts within our power here within the United States or in a particular country. So what is it? We need to increase funds. We've got a lot of different accounts that the United States has in its official overseas development assistance, and also other countries need to step up as donor nations. But we also need innovation in finance, like debt for nature swaps. We did a deal in the Seychelles to write off $22 million of the national debt in exchange for 13 new marine protected areas. So next slide. We need to also use policy levers in addition to these financial levers. Right now, the Convention on Biological Diversity, where I used to work, one of the Rio agreements from 1992 started a process on how to conserve 30% of the world by 2030. That first negotiation was in Nairobi in 2019, but the process has been delayed. And what we're doing now is working with the new administration to push this conservation 30 by 30 effort. So what do we need to do? Next slide, please. We know that the majority of Americans know and see and appreciate the connections, and they want to do something about it. And there's also growing recognition that in developing countries in particular, natural resource scarcity, as you've heard, and also biodiversity loss increase this risk of conflict and stability. And so as you're getting it from the gist of this talk here, what we're doing is we're pushing natural security, that it's really an important part of our national security. And not only do we need to increase our funding, but we also need to change the perception of how we talk about national security and incorporate natural resources into it and really make it a priority. And you all in this audience in World Oregon are doing your part, and Senator Merkley is doing his part as well. And so we need to do more of what we're doing here and spread the message that there is a way to do this, and there actually is hope, and we can do it all together. So in closing, I would like to just really reinforce that the world is less safe when we've got criminals that profit from stealing and poaching countries' wildlife and their natural resources. And we also know that shortages of freshwater, food, and natural resources lead to instability and conflict. So this is a message about what we can do. We can act now before we lose more nature. And this is smart because not only do we believe it's the right thing to do, but we also know that targeted US investment in international conservation efforts contributes to America's long-term foreign policy objectives, and it enhances our own economic and national security interest around the globe. Thanks so much, and I think we're ready for some questions.
Thank you, Tom. That was really insightful. We do have a few questions. We have questions coming in through the chat, but and I will try to sort of do the best we can with these questions. And maybe the first one is, I would like to pose this to Senator Merkley, combining a couple of the questions in the chat. Senator, you serve on both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as well as the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Ops. This means that you have a unique ability to not only shape US policy, but also find ways to ensure policy mandates that are backed by public investment. Could you talk a little bit about considerations coming before the Congress that help address the global biodiversity and climate crises at the moment? And where would you like to see ecologists help inform foreign aid and defense operations for the United States? And how can the administration be helping in this effort?
Okay, thank you. Has several complicated parts to it. I'll see what I can hit. First, let's start with the premise that science has to be at the center of policy. What we had over the last 4 years under the Trump administration was complete disregard. So at that point, if you'd asked the question, how are ecologists integrating themselves? I would have said ecologists are fleeing the federal government. They are being completely ignored. Terms like climate change are being stripped off government websites. It plays no role in the considerations of our foreign affairs. The EPA is losing massive amounts of talent, Environmental Protection Agency, which, because of all the folks there with environmental specialties, they can also concern themselves not with just the environment in the United States, but also insights and advice internationally. I think we do have an administration now that has the opposite view, that says science is very important. We need these voices, we need this knowledge, we need to invest in creating it, and we need to have policies respond to it. And those policies appropriately have both the economic side and the action side. And I was thinking about this as both the wonderful presentation from Ms. Cavallo and from Tom Kors. The money is going to need to be invested in major ways for these goals. But also, I mentioned, just as an example, a policy about palm oil and how it's viewed and how we change the use of that in our economy, and how do we change that through policy or through incentives because of the driver it is, or how do we work with Indonesia to have policies about protecting the remaining rainforest. It isn't just a devastation of the rainforest, you also have the biomass underneath it dries out and releases vast amounts of carbon into the air, and then you have a huge impact on biodiversity at the same time. I mean, it's kind of a triple threat to the planet. I know you had many components of your question, which I didn't track all of them, but that's the main things that came to mind as you posed it, was the importance of putting policy back forefront and of American leadership. So what would happen if the President of the United States decided to have not just an annual State of the Union, but a State of the World, where we'd talk about the environmental consequences around the planet, or in the State of the Union, talk about American leadership in the world on these issues? You end up with a very different place. I do want to note that in the appointment of John Kerry as an international climate ambassador, we have said we understand that these issues are world issues, and we're going to work in partnership with the world. And John was still in the Senate when I was here. I worked with him a lot in 2009, 2010, as we tried to develop major climate policy, which ultimately fell short. But he has been so invested then as a Secretary of State that he has both the climate and the policy background and the diplomatic credentials to carry tremendous weight. So that was a great appointment that symbolizes American leadership and partnership with the world in taking on these issues.
Thank you, Senator. I apologize for giving you a multi-part question. if there is, to keep this thread going, if there is more that you would like to see from the administration at this time, what would those areas be in addressing biodiversity loss and climate change?
I think that we haven't heard the administration they've talked about climate a lot, and they're working intensely on that. But in terms of wildlife trafficking, which was mentioned by our experts as having a huge impact, I couldn't believe that statistic that Tom mentioned about the capturing a haul of pangolin scales that I think you said were worth billions of dollars, if I caught that right, Tom. We need to have a stronger international voice on wildlife trafficking. I mentioned the bill that got passed that created an incentive for whistleblowers inside these trafficking pathways to protect them, to assist them. But it really needs to become an area where America works hard, because if there's an economic incentive and an illegal trade to strip wildlife out of the forest, people will strip wildlife out of the forest and out of other ecosystems, and hugely devastating, but largely hidden.
Thank you, Senator. The next question, I would like to address it to my colleague, Tom Course. Tom, in your presentation, you discuss utilization of policy and public funding measures available to the US government to address biodiversity loss. Could you share an example of such a program or policy and how it advances American interests while also conserving important biodiversity?
Sure. One of the really just kind of landmark programs is housed within the U.S. Agency for International Development. Strangely, it's called the USAID Biodiversity Conservation Program. And basically that gives assistance for conservation to focus on priority threats for biodiversity, and also addresses other sectors to improve conservation and development results. And USAID has a new biodiversity strategy, and USAID has been involved in helping countries for more than 50 years. And this focus program really looks at resource loss and degradation. And right now, the funds are targeted on tier 1 programs such as tier 1 countries such as Kenya and Tanzania, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and also countries in the Amazon and Congo basin. And each year Congress funds that program. And we've been working this program up just because it's so successful. And it hit $320 million last year, and we're hoping to fund that program at $500 million over the next year. But it's just a really great example of how, as I was talking about earlier, how really conservation is a way to sustain peace. We've got so many wonderful examples from success stories within countries about keeping jobs where they are and sustaining jobs, which result in people staying. And there's not as much movement and migration and, kind of resultant conflict. So that's just one example, but there are many others that the U.S. government, does directly through our overseas development channels, but also we work in concert with other countries in kind of multilateral settings as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. We have time for one more question, and I would like to pose that to Christine. Christine, the report on ecological security that you shared with us today elaborates on infectious disease emergence and environmental crimes as sources of insecurity and instability around the world. As we heard from Senator Merkley today about how not only can the US, but also the rest of the world come together to address these issues, what recommendations do you have for governments to do more of or differently to alleviate these stressors?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, just generally speaking, the current events going on within this administration leave me feeling pretty optimistic. The new Intel community reports and the Leader Summit on Climate at the end of April were both really great in demonstrating that our climate vision and our ecological security vision goes beyond just the Pentagon, which I think is critical. The takeaways both for crime, for the pandemic prevention, for all of these systems are demanding this duality of local solutions at global scales. So reaching out to those local communities, making sure that at personal levels, we are able to understand what a certain community needs, what resources are necessary, how to communicate between those different spaces to make sure that our globalized system is able to support people in effective ways. Because if there's a weak link in the chain, that's really all it takes for a pandemic spillover to happen, or for crime to be able to propagate between international borders. And that is something with environmental crime in particular. I think targeting it on a multifaceted level, not just confiscations, which is where a lot of policy is focused, but also cracking down on the demand side, putting some kinks in the entire system of illicit crime, the broader systems, rather than just the one-off seizures, which I think a lot of policy is centered on right now. With regard to pandemic, similarly, like the earlier that we can intercept these pandemic related issues, these spillover events, these risks of disease, the sooner we're able to engage with those upstream rather than how we are currently, which is very reactive. That saves lives, and it saves money, and it's time efficient and just increases global security. So we're talking about a lot of things that are fundamentally tied to human happiness, hierarchy of needs. Like these are basic things. And so the key way that I think we get to the solutions here is by developing and integrating new and emerging expertise. So people who are on the front lines researching this, who know where the world is going. And if personally, I would love to see us challenging all of our existing systems in pursuit of a better future trajectory, one that has an eye for resiliency against a broad future, not looking at different options and saying, oh my gosh, that's volatile, that could go any which direction, but building a base where what we currently in today's world see as volatile, wide-ranging, very erratic, it just fits into the scope naturally, because we've been able to kind of build that resiliency into our foundations and move forward with a much stronger position. And that goes for wildlife crime in addressing the root causes of it, the markets of it, as well as pandemic systems, all the way from the jump over point from species into human reservoirs, to all the way downstream to vaccine production and distribution. So there's a lot of different ways that we can strengthen our entire global systems. And I think an eye to that is the path forward for all of this.
Thank you, Christine. I know we're at time. I want to thank all of our guests for joining. If any of the topics discussed today are of interest, please visit naturalsecurity.us. I want to leave this with one final word from the Senator. If you want to say anything in closing, Senator, the floor is yours.
I'm so pleased that we have experts like Tom and like Christine, who can bring so many facts to bear, so many studies, and have organizations that can work to implement strategies in the field. We sometimes think, if just those foreign governments would get their acts together, we could move quickly. But if we look here at home, we can see how hard it can be. One of the projects I've been working on is preservation of the monarch butterfly. The Western monarch, there are two main monarch pathways, is on the verge of extinction. And it has crashed over the last 10 years down to just a few thousand butterflies. Why are we losing the monarchs? Well, because of the way that we cultivate land, which has to do with resources, as we've been noting, and also the type of herbicides and pesticides that we use that affect the availability of milkweed and death of the insects. And so here we are, a prosperous country that is responding very slowly to a specific beloved insect that people kind of smile and say, oh, let's save the monarchs, but we're not doing it. So I just want to note the complexity and challenge that exist. And it means that we have to have really dedicated perseverance and collaboration and with the issues that arise within our own country and in partnership with the rest of the world. Humankind has become such a substantial share of the biomass on the planet between ourselves and our livestock that we're having just this massive impact in a short period of time. I was recently reading a book called The Fossil Men, and I'm only partway through it, but it's looking at the origins of human species branching off from the other great apes about 5 million years ago. You think about this, Homo sapiens have been around about 200,000 years. 5 million years ago is a long time. But when we talk about many episodes of the large dinosaurs, we're talking about 150 million years ago. What we have done in the last 150 years, just 150 years, 5 human generations, if you will, or 6 human generations, as we've tapped into the energy from coal and oil, natural gas, is a massive transformation of our planet. We have to have a massive acceleration of our response to the impact that we're creating through that acceleration. So thank you to the World Affairs Council, the Nature Conservancy, and the Center for Strategic Risk. You all are part of that increased active response, and we need all the partners we can get inside government, outside government, internationally. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. With that, we can close this event today. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.